Hello, and welcome to the City of Waterloo Museum, located in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. We like to tell stories that connect Waterloo to our local community, but also to our global families. Today, our tour will be looking at our Health in Space Dare to Explore exhibit. This exhibit was put together by the Canadian Aviation and Space Museum and the Canadian Space Agency. We are also thrilled to be joined by the International Women's Air and Space Museum located in Cleveland, Ohio, the United States. Their goal is to ensure the history and culture of women in aviation and aerospace from all over the world is shared to inspire future generations. Now, during our tour, we will be exploring some of the aspects of life in space. We will be exploring what it would be like to actually live in space. And I want you to ask yourself, would that be something I would want to do? And as we meet some of the amazing women who have called space home, think to yourself, is that something I'm interested in? So sit back and enjoy this multi-museum tour. Now, if you were to think of some of the big differences between life here on Earth and life in space, what do you think of? I know that for me, I think of gravity. Being that there is no gravity in space, you can imagine what life is like without being able to actually put your feet down on the ground. When there's no up and no down, can you imagine what that might be like? But in space, that's a regular day in life. That's what it feels like when you are falling around Earth at 28,000 kilometers an hour. Can you imagine? That's faster than the speed of sound. How do you think that might affect your body? Well, living in space can affect your body in many different ways. The first one that I want to share with you is actually how it affects your eyes. In space, since you don't have the same forces pulling down on your body, your eyes can actually change shape. Now, our bodies are designed to pump blood against gravity pulling down on us. Right? So when they're in space and we have no gravity, our blood can actually gather in our heads. And that extra fluid in an astronaut's head can cause an increase in pressure, which pushes down on the nerves in the eye, causing the eye to actually flatten out. Think about if you were to hang upside down and the blood was rushing to your head. That's because of gravity, and you can actually feel that pressure increasing in your head as you do so. Another effect space has on our bodies has to do with our bones. Give one of your bones a quick squeeze. It should feel strong and healthy. Now, did you know each day a little bit of our bone tissue actually dies? But don't worry, our bodies naturally replace that dying bone tissue, and it keeps us nice and strong and healthy bones. But in space, things are just a little bit different. Our bone tissue still dies, just like it does here on Earth, but in space, it doesn't replenish just as quickly as it dies. This means that when astronauts come back home, their bones are actually weaker than they were before, because they have less bone tissue than they did before. Now, scientists are still trying to study and learn more from the astronauts about why this actually happens. One of those scientists is Dr. Richard Hewson, who lives right here in Waterloo. Now, Dr. Hewson works for the Research Institute of Aging in Waterloo, and he creates experiments for astronauts to do in space and when they get back home, so we can learn a little bit more about how their bodies age in space. In fact, he works specifically with the hearts of the astronauts. Now, for many of us, we know that our heart pumps the blood all over our bodies. It pumps our blood to places like our arms and our legs and our brains, just to mention a few. Our blood is really important to our bodies because it brings the oxygen to places like our muscles and other tissues so our bodies can keep moving. The blood also removes any waste tissue, so any tissues in our body that have died and needs to come out of our bodies. Now, for our heart to be able to pump that blood all over, it uses little tubes that we can call arteries. Now, these arteries are all over our bodies, and that's what the blood moves around in. When we are young, these tubes, or arteries, are very healthy. They're flexible and elastic, Kind of like a new rubber band or a skipping rope, they move really easily. As we get older, these arteries get harder to move, and they're more fragile and weaker and can break much easier. This means that our heart has to work even harder to pump the blood all over our bodies as we get older. Now, through Dr. Houston's work, we've learned that astronauts' bodies actually age faster than ours here on Earth. His research shows that they age between 17 and 30% faster every 6 months. That means that our arteries, the things that pump the blood all over our bodies, age about 10 to 20 years faster for astronauts who go to space. What is also interesting from his research is that women are less impacted by these discoveries, meaning that women's arteries can recover, and that means staying nice and elastic and healthy, better than that of men's when they return back to Earth. Interesting work that Dr. Houston is doing, isn't it? Now, let's head back over to the International Women's Air and Space Museum to find out a little bit more about some of the challenges astronauts face while they're in space, and if there's anything they can do about it to help keep them healthy in space.
One of the very important things that astronauts have to do while they're up on the International Space Station is keep in shape, which is of course important here on Earth. But it's also even more important up in space because astronauts' bodies are not in gravity when they're up in space. They're in zero gravity. So they don't have all your blood in your body all over the place in your body. It kind of pools up more in your head. And in order for them to maintain good physical abilities, they need to work out about 2 hours every day. And they have different kind of devices to use up on the International Space Station. One is a treadmill, and that treadmill has a harness up on the shoulders to keep the astronaut actually attached to the treadmill, because remember, we're in zero gravity and they can't just run in place like I could right here on Earth. They have to be connected to the treadmill so they don't float away while they're running in space. And that's something that actually they did testing for in Cleveland, where we are right now, at the NASA Glenn Research Center. They tried to figure out what kind of a harness would work to keep an astronaut secure to the treadmill in order that they wouldn't float off while they're running in space. Another kind of device used while they're in space is something called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device. And that's kind of like a weightlifting machine. So they don't really have the ability to lift regular weights in space. They have a device that they practice on in order to lift weights and get a full body workout using that. And then one other device, that's a bicycle. But when you work on a bicycle, an exercise bike on Earth, you've got a seat that you can sit on while you're pedaling. But in space, there's no seat because it's zero gravity. You don't need a seat, but you still need the pedals, and you pedal on the bike to get that cardiovascular workout, like you're pedaling a bicycle. So they have these 3 devices, and each astronaut needs to do a workout of about 2 hours every day while they're in space in order to maintain their fitness when they're up there for about 6 months on a long duration mission at a time.
Wow, can you imagine working out in space like that? Is that something you think you would maybe want to try? Well, being in space isn't just hard on our bodies, it's also hard on our minds, or psychologically. Think about what taking a trip to space would be like. You don't get to bring your friends or your family, your pets with you. You can't take some of your favorite things like your house or your bed or your toys with you. So what are things that astronauts do to take care of their mental health while they are 400 kilometers away from Earth? Well, just like here on Earth, they do that in many different ways. For example, they have weekly video calls with their loved ones who are back here on Earth. Sometimes they even get care packages sent to them all the way up in outer space, and they could have small gifts, fun memories to share with their loved ones who are down here on Earth. They also celebrate holidays together. You can see this photo. They actually have decorated the International Space Station for Christmas. And some astronauts even bring music with them to space. All of these are different things that can bring them joy and help them to take care of themselves when they're isolated and far from home. But do you ever wonder how they might prepare for a challenge like living in space?
As part of the psychological testing, one of the things that was done was sensory isolation tank in water. This is an image of Jerry Cobb from Life magazine when she did her sensory deprivation testing. And Wally Funk also was one of the women who did the isolation tank experiment. And it was to see, here you are in a water tank in your bathing suit, but nothing else happening. No light, no interaction with anyone, and how long you could maintain yourself floating with a floating device to be in that kind of a tank. How long could you do that for? Well, Wally did it for over 10 hours, which was a really long time to be floating in a water tank. And then the male astronauts, the Mercury 7 astronauts, they had a different kind of sensory testing. Theirs was being kept in a smaller room with things to write on, that sort of thing. So it was a different kind of testing that the Mercury male astronauts had versus the women, Mercury 13 women.
Space sounds like it's full of challenges, both for our bodies, physically, and for our minds, psychologically. Do you think you're cut out for space travel? Do you have what it takes to be the next astronauts heading to space? Well, let's take a minute and meet some of the incredible women who did. These women have worked very hard to become astronauts and learned a lot about their bodies and minds to overcome all of what it takes to become an astronaut. Let's head over to the International Women's Air and Space Museum to meet some of these incredible women.
And here at the International Women's Air and Space Museum, we have a wall of women astronauts and cosmonauts. We kind of ran out of space, which is kind of a good thing, actually, because we have a lot more going up, so that's nice. And you might recognize this Canadian woman, Roberta Bondar. So she was the first Canadian female astronaut, and she was active during the space shuttle era. So the space shuttle first went up in 1981 and was retired in 2011. But she went up in the space shuttle, and she was on a mission with a laboratory confined inside of the space shuttle in the payload bay. And she was a payload specialist for that flight and did a lot of neurological kind of studies because she's a medical doctor. And they also did physiological studies, but again, not to the point that they're doing it now on the International Space Station, because now they're up there for 6 months at a time. During the space shuttle era, they would be up in space for maybe a week to 10 days maximum, that sort of thing. And also we have Mae Jemison, and she was the first African-American female astronaut in space. Not only was she a real astronaut in space, but she was also one on a Star Trek Next Generation episode. And we also have another first, Shokai Mukai, and she was the first female astronaut from Japan. She was also a medical doctor before she became an astronaut. And one of the flights that she flew on was with John Glenn. And he, of course, flew on his Mercury flight back in the 1960s. But he also flew on a space shuttle flight in 1997. And at that point, he was 77 years old. And they wanted to test the effects of an aging astronaut in space. So Dr. Mukai was one of the medical doctors on that flight, and there was also one other medical astronaut on that flight. And Again, this is in the shuttle era, so it was not for a long duration mission. It's for a shorter duration mission, but they could do some of the scientific testing, blood tests that were needed in order to find out what were the effects on an aging astronaut. Of course, now we know that you can have older people in space because Wally Funk, who was one of the Mercury women test subjects, she flew in space last year on Blue Origin flight, suborbital flight, and she was 82 years old when she flew in space, becoming the oldest woman in space. And also William Shatner flew on a Blue Origin flight, and he was in his 90s when he flew. So there's a lot more testing going on. Older people can fly in space. And nowadays, we have some women going up in space. We have currently right up now on the International Space Station, Kayla Barron is an American astronaut, and she went up there on a SpaceX Dragon commercial crew vehicle. And in April, Jessica Watkins will be flying up on a SpaceX commercial crew vehicle, and she's going to be the first African American woman to live on the International Space Station on a long duration mission. So some of the women who are from the Space Shuttle program were able to visit the International Space Station, but no African American woman actually has lived on the International Space Station as a crew member on a long duration mission until Jessica goes up in April.
Thank you so much for joining us for our tour today. If you enjoyed the tour, feel free to join us on March 17th at 6 p.m., where we will be exploring a little bit more about what living and working in space is really all about. Now, on behalf of the International Women's Air and Space Museum and the City of Waterloo Museum, I want to thank you for joining us today. And if you happen to find yourself in Cleveland, Ohio, or Waterloo, Ontario, please feel free to stop by our buildings and see us in person. Have a wonderful day!